Hey guys, it's the Mobley5, and welcome to my response to Film Theory's Can a Doctor Who Doctor Actually Exist theory, parts 1 and 2. This theory proposes the idea that it is possible for a Time Lord, or at least someone with the characteristics of a Time Lord, to exist in real life. This is a response that I've had on my mind for a very long time. When Film Theory first started and I saw that they made a theory on Doctor Who, it piqued my interest. I've mentioned this once before, but it was 2 years ago, so 99% of people are likely unaware of this. I am a Whovian. I've watched Doctor Who ever since I was 7, I think? I know it was around the beginning of David Tennant's run as the Doctor. And when I watched part 1 of this theory, I had some personal gripes with it and considered making a response, but decided to wait for part 2 to come out. Then part 2 eventually came out, and I also had some personal gripes with it. But MatPat said there was going to be a part 3, so I decided to wait for that. And then part 3 was trapped in a big ball of wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff until November of this year. But I thought that part 3 was really good, and not because MatPat plays devil's advocate with himself, but because I thought the arguments for the theory were very well presented. Which is why I'm only covering parts 1 and 2 in this response, and why this response took so long for me to make. I swear that I'm not making this to capitalize on the Christmas special where we'll see the 13th Doctor. That's just how it worked out. But as I've always said in the past, I don't have anything against MatPat, game theory, or film theory, as I even made a top 10 best game theory videos countdown, and I've defended MatPat over his segment during the Gaster theory on multiple occasions, as I honestly believe that a lot of people have, although possibly unintentionally, manipulated his words in regards to that. Even though they accuse me of manipulating their words by manipulating mine, which just further proves my point. Hey, he's the one who brought it up. I'm just defending myself since I was denied that right for most of 2017. But on the subject of that segment, there's something that I also want to address before really getting into this response. When I first saw that segment, it made me realize the error of my ways and feel terrible. When you're making these kinds of videos, it's so easy to just say whatever you want, because you're not saying it to that person's face, but it also means that you don't consider the repercussion your words or actions may have on that person if they see your video. I realized that a lot of the things I've said, or the tone of voice I've used in my previous responses to MatPat, and my older responses in general, could easily come across as hurtful, and I wouldn't blame anyone for feeling that way since I sounded very mean-spirited, especially in the case of the Frozen theory. Mainly because I have trouble controlling my tempo when something annoys me. And MatPat showed me what a negative effect this can have on people, as all the hurtful comments he got in relation to Sans' Ness and why I gave the Pope Undertale severely damaged his morale when talking about Undertale. And I feel responsible for that, since I'm one of the people that caused all the increased hate towards MatPat due to spamming responses left, right, and center. This was one of 2 reasons why for 2017 I decided to clean up my act and be much calmer and mature in most of my responses, so that I don't end up hurting anyone else. And after suffering from constant verbal abuse, psychological scarring, headaches, and migraines, I don't wish for anyone else to go through what I have, except for the people who do or cause that stuff without taking responsibility for their actions. I'm not asking for sympathy, just explaining myself. So even though I doubt MatPat is watching this, if by the off chance he is, I sincerely apologize for anything I said or phrased that has come across as mean-spirited, and for any hurtful comments that have been made towards you as a result of what I've done in the past. Honestly, the only reason why I'm making this response is just because I've had these feelings about this theory for almost 3 years and just want to get them off my chest since this theory isn't really bad, and I think that both game theory and film theory have significantly improved in 2017. So after that drawn-out intro, let's get into it, starting with part 1, which focuses on the Doctor's biology, and the section on the Doctor's 2 hearts. Allons-y!
Well, get this. It's not only possible, we've all lived with 2 hearts at some point in our lives. Mind blown. When we humans are in the embryonic stage of development, we actually do have 2 hearts. This stage is called the heart primordial. The 2 hearts do eventually fuse together into 1 heart with 4 chambers, but yes, at some point we've all had a binary vascular system.
My gripe with this piece of evidence is that the second heart found in embryos disappears when they fuse together into 1, meaning that it's only a temporary stage in a human's lifespan rather than being a permanent part of their anatomy, as is the case with Time Lords. You do mention a study in which scientists prevented tadpoles from having their hearts fused together, and they grew up with 2 hearts, but
In humans, though, no similar experiments have been done, for obvious reasons.
meaning that there isn't conclusive proof that a human could survive from these kinds of experiments. Plus, even if a human did go through an experiment like this, it would still technically mean that they got a second heart artificially, like with the surgeries you mentioned earlier, rather than naturally retaining the second heart from the embryo stage in the way the Time Lords do. Skipping the part on the Doctor's heartbeats per minute because MatPat easily proves how that's possible.
There's one more biologic component to our Time Lord, his incredibly low body temperature.
So, can you drop that by nearly 40 degrees and still live to match the Doctor's 59-degree internal temperature? Well, let's see. Us humans aren't like Gallifreyans. We're incredibly sensitive creatures. Mild hypothermia sets in at 95 degrees Fahrenheit, amnesia at 91, and loss of consciousness at 82. Any body temp below 70 and you're pretty much screwed. However, there is one recorded instance of an adult surviving a body temperature of 56.7 degrees. Anna Elizabeth Johansson Bogenholm, a Swedish radiologist, or Time Lord in disguise maybe, who survived 80 minutes in freezing water after a skiing accident left her trapped under a layer of ice. During that time, she had extreme hypothermia, and her body temperature dropped to 13.7 degrees Celsius, 56.7 degrees Fahrenheit. After being rescued and transported by helicopter to a hospital, more than 100 doctors and nurses worked in shifts for 9 hours to save Anna's life. She woke up 10 days later after the accident, paralyzed from the neck down, and then spent 2 months recovering in an intensive care unit. The miraculous thing, though, is she's now almost 100% recovered.
Similarly to the previous points I made, Anna's body temperature dropped to that level as a result of hyperthermia from being in cold water, while the Doctor's body temperature is his average body temperature, meaning that it's what his body temperature is usually at naturally, rather than having to go through some experience that drops your temperature to that level. Also, in Anna's case, she needed a lot of medical treatment in order to survive, and was initially paralyzed from the neck down. So while humans can survive at that cold of a temperature, they do require aid and support in order to do this, while the Doctor doesn't have any issues with his, or I guess her soon, body being so cold.
And that was the lowest body temperature in history until another Swede, a 7-year-old named Stella, survived nearly drowning and getting down to 13 degrees Celsius. That's 55.4 degrees Fahrenheit.
Like with Anna, Stella's body temperature dropped so low due to the freezing conditions of the water, rather than having an average body temperature of 13 degrees. Again, she was able to survive the ordeal, but it doesn't really match the case with the Doctor. And that's the end of part 1, so moving on to part 2, which focuses on time travel, or basically how the TARDIS works, and go into the part that I actually have stuff to say about, since MatPat has to explain a lot on Albert Einstein's theories, relativistic speed, and how wormholes work, which I have no gripes with.
Let's say that the TARDIS is able to maintain wormhole stability and travel through it unharmed. Would they actually be able to get back in time? Well, the answer is both yes and no. The problem with wormholes is actually less about the how they work and more about the when they work. Physicists believe that in theory you can actually use a wormhole to travel back in time to the time that the wormhole was created. Want to go back to see that hilarious time when everyone had the Black Plague? Me slapping Riot that one. You'd actually have to have been at the Black Plague the first time and intentionally set up a wormhole for yourself so you could come back and relive those beautiful moments of pustular swelling. A wormhole is basically just like a glorified web browser bookmark, like the Watch Later tab or the YouTube subscribe button, letting you earmark moments in time you might want to come back to later. But if you've never been there before, there's no way you could create the wormhole you'd need, and there's no solid evidence of the Doctor setting up wormholes as little reminders to themselves to come back later. Quite honestly, it's really difficult to believe that the Doctor could actually be able to use a wormhole to travel back in time.
Actually, at the time, I thought the possibility of the TARDIS being able to create wormholes in the desired time period, seeing as how this is science fiction, what with the dinosaurs on the spaceship, which is actually the name of that episode, and we are talking about an object that's bigger on the inside and can project itself as a woman. I know this is really unfair to bring up this piece of evidence considering that the episode it originates from came out after this part of the theory, but it's something that I feel is worth mentioning because it actually supports my hypothesis. In the first episode of Series 9, The Magician's Apprentice, when trying to find the Doctor, Clara and Unit locate Missy by tracking the appearance of wormholes and discovering the one she most recently created. And with Missy being the master regenerated as a woman, she has a TARDIS of her own, meaning that it's possible that Missy's TARDIS created these wormholes that she could travel to those locations. As if she had already been there before to create the wormhole in the first place, how would Clara be able to track down which one had most recently appeared? Otherwise, Missy would just have to go there without the TARDIS, which seems unlikely considering that shortly after meeting Clara in that location, Missy takes her back in time to find the Doctor.
So despite the fact that Doctor Who seems to use wormholes as his mail tube through space-time, according to modern physics, without that initial wormhole being created as early in time as possible, there are just certain moments in time the Doctor wouldn't be able to access.
Well, the official name for the wormhole is actually the time vortex. I know it's nitpicking since it acts the same as a wormhole, but in regards to science, there are differences between wormholes and vortexes, the latter being the place where energy crosses. Plus, according to this wiki page, so take this with a grain of salt, the time vortex is located outside of time and the universe, which could further explain how the TARDIS travels through time. Since the time vortex exists out of time, meaning that it is a very misleading name, it would suggest that it isn't bound by the laws of time, like always having to move forward.
A Tipler cylinder is literally a cylinder of space-time, which, interesting, looks a lot like our wormhole from earlier on, but actually has different properties for matter that travels through it. The cylinder itself is made up of lots and lots of dense mass, including positive and negative matter. Our Whovian physicists explain that the TARDIS's ability to move through a Tipler cylinder depends on the angle at which you enter the cylinder. If you enter it straight on, then you're kind of screwed, because you're headed straight for the central point of gravity way in the center of this thing, so that once you enter, you're unable to leave without literally going faster than the speed of light. Not ideal. But what if you enter it at an angle? Models of Tipler cylinders today theorize that if you enter the cylinder on an angle, remember this is an angle of not just space, but space-time, that you'd be able to escape being caught in the cylinder forever. Instead, you'd basically surf across the inside of the cylinder at an angle and end up in a position where you actually continue following the curve of the cylinder backwards in time, because that makes a whole lot of sense. Essentially, the TARDIS would be riding a curve of time, or what's known in quantum physics as a closed time curve, or CTC. A CTC would allow the TARDIS to escape getting crushed forever in the mass of the cylinder and explore any number of infinite time curves all around the Tipler cylinder. So, unlike our wormhole before, the TARDIS isn't trying to travel through it, it's trying to curve around it. You can even see this in the opening sequence that the TARDIS isn't really moving in a straight line, it moves at angles.
I think that the whole point on Tipler cylinders and how it matches the Doctor Who intro is very well presented since the science is there and it's linked to the show. My only gripe with this part is just to do with the time vortex thing I mentioned earlier, since that could already explain how the TARDIS works. If the wiki information is true, since I haven't read the books it's cited as sources. And due to a vortex typically being a swirling motion like a whirlpool, which in turn could also explain why the TARDIS circles around the vortex. So I guess there are two possible explanations for how this occurs. And that's everything I need to bring up, since that ends part 2. I don't have any gripes with part 3, and my only other gripes are that the sonic screwdriver and regeneration weren't covered despite being stated as categories in part 1, unless Comte de Saint-Germain's various appearances across history were in different forms, but that isn't stated. This video ended up being much shorter than I was expecting when it came to my counter-arguments. Well, part of that was due to having to skip a lot of scientific explanatory build-up to save time because there wasn't anything wrong, in quotes, with it. I guess I just let my gripes with this theory overcloud everything else about it, which makes this response now come across as pretty forced. As I said before, this theory isn't bad, it's just that I had a few gripes with it. For biology, while there isn't any issues with the evidence itself, it doesn't really apply to what the theory is trying to prove, as the cases given don't match to the Doctor. And for time travel, the show and its lore has given other possible explanations for this. Don't get me wrong, I still enjoyed the theory in the end, and liked the idea of it. It's just that I wanted to say this stuff for so long since this theory started back in my more toxic days. And since I can imagine some people telling me, "How dare you! MatPat worked on this theory for 3 years and you ruined it! You should be locked up!" I have one thing to say.
Yes. I'll just step inside this police box and arrest myself.
But before I do that, I'll say that I'll see you guys for my next response video. I know I'm beating a dead horse here, but I have a lot to say about the subject as I take on my biggest target yet.